Damon Cross had always been the kind of man who enjoyed a challenge. He was well known in the rougher parts of London, not for being the smartest or the richest, but for being the toughest. Ever since he was a teenager, he had loved proving himself in fights. Whether it was in a back alley or outside a pub, he never backed down. In fact, he always looked for the next big fight, the one that would make people talk about him for weeks. One evening, Damon sat with his group of friends in a crowded cafe, listening to them talk about his past fights. They laughed as they remembered how he had once taken down a man twice his size. "There's no one in this city who can take you," one of them said, shaking his head in admiration. Damon leaned back in his chair with a proud smirk. "Maybe not," he said, tapping his fingers on the table. "But I want something bigger, something that'll make people remember my name forever." Another friend, grinning mischievously, spoke up. "You know what would really get people talking? If you could make one of those royal guards move. No one can break them. They stand like statues, no matter what." The group chuckled, but Damon's smirk turned into a thoughtful look. He had heard of the royal guards, soldiers who stood completely still outside Buckingham Palace, dressed in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats. Tourists always tried to make them react, shouting jokes, making funny faces, even pretending to trip in front of them. But nothing worked. The guards didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't react. It was almost unnatural. Damon's eyes gleamed with excitement. "What if I could do more than just make one move?" he said. "What if I could actually challenge him? Show the world that these guards aren't as tough as they pretend to be." The group went silent for a moment. Some looked at each other, unsure. "That might not be a good idea," one of them muttered. "Those guys are trained soldiers, man. They're not just for show." Damon laughed. "Trained for what? Standing still," he said mockingly. "Come on, if they were real fighters, they wouldn't just stand there like statues. I bet they don't even know how to throw a proper punch." Excitement built up in the group. The idea of Damon challenging a royal guard was crazy, but it was also thrilling. If he could actually do it, if he could make a guard react, maybe even make him fight, he would be a legend. One of his friends pulled out his phone. "We should record it," he suggested. "If you actually pull this off, the video will go viral." Damon grinned, already imagining the headlines. "Then let's do it," he said, standing up. "Tomorrow, Buckingham Palace. I'll show everyone that those guards aren't as untouchable as they seem." As the group cheered, Damon felt the familiar rush of excitement. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. Thomas Whittaker had always been a disciplined man. From a young age, he believed in rules, respect, and hard work. That belief had led him to join the British Army, where he trained for years to become one of the finest soldiers. His dedication and discipline earned him a place in the Royal Guard, a position of honor and responsibility. Standing outside Buckingham Palace every day was no simple task. While some people thought the guards were just for show, Thomas knew better. The job required extreme focus, both mental and physical. He had been trained to stand still for hours, no matter what happened around him. Tourists tried to distract him all the time, making faces, telling jokes, even waving their hands in front of his eyes. But he never moved. That was the rule. A royal guard only reacted when absolutely necessary. His job was not just about standing still, it was about protecting one of the most important places in the country, and he took that responsibility seriously. Behind his calm and silent appearance, he was always alert, always watching. If a real threat appeared, he would be ready. That morning, as Thomas got dressed in his red uniform and placed the tall black bearskin hat on his head, he prepared himself for another long shift. The palace grounds would be busy with visitors as always. He took his position, gripping his rifle firmly, his eyes straight ahead. He had done this countless times before. As the hours passed, people walked by, taking photos and whispering about how still he was. Some tried to make him laugh, others made silly poses next to him. He ignored them all, standing as strong as a statue. He had mastered the art of stillness. But then, something changed. A group of young men arrived, louder than the usual tourists. They were not here to admire the palace or take polite photos. They had come with a purpose. And at the center of the group was a man who walked with too much confidence, as if he owned the place. His name was Damon Cross. Damon smirked as he stood in front of Thomas, looking him up and down. "So, this is it," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This is what they call the toughest guard in the world." His friends laughed, pulling out their phones to record. Some tourists stopped to watch, sensing that something unusual was about to happen. Thomas remained still, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He had seen people like Damon before, people who thought they could break the discipline of the royal guard. He knew exactly what they wanted. Damon stepped closer, tilting his head. "I bet you're not even allowed to talk," he said. "What's the matter? Afraid you'll lose if you fight me?" More laughter followed, but Thomas didn't react. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to entertain. His job was simple: stand his ground and protect the palace. Damon, however, was not ready to give up so easily. He had come for a challenge, and he wasn't leaving without one. And soon, he would learn a lesson he would never forget. A crowd had gathered. Tourists, locals, and even security guards stood at a distance, watching as Damon Cross continued to taunt the royal guard. The air was filled with excitement and curiosity. People whispered among themselves, wondering if the guard would finally react. Damon's friends stood nearby, their phones raised, recording every moment. They were grinning, enjoying the show. Damon had always been the loudest and most fearless in their group, and now he was proving it in front of everyone. Damon took a step closer, examining the guard's face. "Look at him," he said loudly, pointing at Thomas. "He's like a statue. I wonder if he's even real." Some people in the crowd chuckled, but others shook their heads, sensing that this wasn't a good idea. Thomas Whittaker, the royal guard, remained motionless. His eyes stared straight ahead, his hands gripping his rifle firmly. He had been trained for moments like these. His duty was to stand his ground, to ignore distractions, and to maintain his discipline. Damon wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He needed to prove that the guard wasn't as strong as people believed. He started circling Thomas, waving his hands in front of his face. Nothing. Not even a blink. He laughed. "Come on, man, you can at least say hello." Still, Thomas did not move. Damon's smirk faded slightly. He expected some kind of reaction, even a small flinch, but the guard was like stone. This only made Damon more determined. He leaned in closer and spoke in a mocking voice. "What if I tell you that you're not as tough as people think? What if I say you're just a guy in a fancy uniform playing pretend?" A few people in the crowd gasped. This was going too far. The royal guards were not just for show. They were trained soldiers. Many of them had real combat experience. But Damon didn't stop. He reached out and waved his hand even closer to Thomas's face, pretending to slap the air in front of him. "See? Nothing," he announced. The tension in the air grew thick. Some of the tourists whispered, wondering what would happen next. Others stepped back, sensing that things were about to change. One of Damon's friends called out, "Maybe he's scared of you, Damon." Damon laughed. "Yeah, maybe he is," he said confidently. "Or maybe he's just not as strong as everyone thinks." Thomas remained silent, but inside, he was fully aware of what was happening. He had faced hecklers before, but this one was different. Damon was pushing the limits. There were rules, but there was also a line that could not be crossed. Damon had no idea how close he was to that line. Feeling bolder, he took another step forward. This time, he lifted his hand as if he was about to poke the guard's shoulder. His fingers were inches away from the soldier's uniform. The crowd held its breath. Damon was about to learn the hard way that the royal guard was not someone to mess with. The crowd had fallen silent. The excitement that once filled the air had turned into nervous anticipation. Everyone's eyes were fixed on Damon Cross as he slowly reached out his hand toward the royal guard. Some people in the crowd whispered to each other, wondering if he would actually touch the soldier. Others shook their heads, sensing that this was a mistake. Damon, however, was full of confidence. He had been taunting the guard for several minutes, and nothing had happened. To him, this was proof that the guard was just for show, that all the stories about their discipline and training were exaggerated. His fingers were just an inch away from Thomas Whittaker's shoulder. "Let's see if you're really made of stone," he muttered with a smirk. And then everything changed. In a single swift motion, Thomas came to life. His feet moved with precision, his hands acted with expert control, and in the blink of an eye, he had taken a firm step forward. The loud stomp of his boot echoed through the courtyard, making several people in the crowd gasp. Damon's smirk disappeared. His body froze. He had not expected this. Without hesitation, Thomas lifted his rifle slightly, gripping it tightly. In a deep, commanding voice, he shouted, "Stand back." The sudden movement and booming voice sent a shockwave through the air. It was as if the entire atmosphere had shifted in an instant. The once laughing crowd was now completely silent. Damon's friends, who had been recording the scene with amusement, lowered their phones slightly, their expressions changing from amusement to shock. Damon stumbled back a step, his confidence shaken. He had been expecting the guard to remain still, to ignore him just like all the others had done before. But this was different. This was real. The look in Thomas's eyes was not one of anger or frustration. It was pure discipline and authority. His stance was firm, his grip on the rifle steady. He was no longer just a guard standing in silence. He was a soldier, trained and ready. A shiver ran down Damon's spine. For the first time, he realized that he might have underestimated the situation. The royal guard was not just a decoration outside the palace. They were trained to handle any threat. And right now, he had made himself look like one. The people in the crowd were still frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. Some of them, realizing how serious this had become, started stepping back, creating more space. Even Damon's friends, who had been cheering him on just moments ago, looked uneasy. Damon swallowed hard, forcing a nervous laugh. "Whoa, okay," he said, raising his hand slightly. "Relax, man, I was just joking." But Thomas didn't react. He had already returned to his stance, his eyes straight ahead once more. His message had been delivered. There were rules, and they would not be broken. Damon exhaled, realizing that he had just come dangerously close to learning that lesson in a much harder way. For the first time in a long while, Damon Cross felt unsure of himself. The royal guard had moved, fast, powerful, and with complete control. His voice had boomed through the courtyard, sending a clear message. This was no game. The crowd was still silent. The laughter and excitement from earlier had completely disappeared. Some people had even put their phones away, realizing that what they were witnessing was not just another silly prank on a palace guard. This was something serious. Damon stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He had spent years building a reputation for being fearless, for never backing down from a challenge. But now, standing before this soldier, he felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. His friends, who had been cheering him on just minutes ago, were now whispering among themselves. One of them muttered, "Maybe we should go, Damon." Another one added, "Man, that was intense." But Damon wasn't ready to walk away just yet. His pride wouldn't let him. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting to see what he would do next. If he just turned around and left, wouldn't that make him look weak? Forcing a smirk, he took a step back but kept his voice light. All right," he said, holding up his hands. "Didn't mean to get you all worked up, just having a bit of fun." Thomas Whittaker remained completely still. His face showed no emotion. It was as if nothing had happened at all. He had reacted only when necessary, and now that the moment had passed, he had returned to his role. Damon let out a small chuckle, hoping to ease the tension. "You're good, I'll give you that," he muttered. "Didn't expect you to move like that." Still, no response, no reaction. Something about the guard's silence unsettled Damon more than anything else. It made him feel small, like his words didn't even matter. He had come here expecting to make a fool out of the guard, but somehow the situation had flipped. He was the one looking foolish now. The crowd slowly began murmuring again, but the energy had changed. Before, people had been waiting to see if the guard would break his discipline. Now, they were watching Damon, wondering if he would be smart enough to leave. A few tourists shook their heads as they walked away, whispering things like, "He had no idea what he was messing with." And that guard handled it perfectly. Damon glanced at his friends, but they no longer looked amused. Instead, they seemed uncomfortable. They had wanted excitement, not trouble. Realizing he had already lost the battle, Damon let out an awkward laugh. "Guess we should get going," he said, trying to sound casual. He turned on his heel, walking away with his friends following close behind. The challenge he had come looking for had ended in a way he never expected. He had thought he could make a royal guard look weak, but instead, the guard's quiet strength had proven something much greater. And deep down, Damon knew he wouldn't be messing with a royal guard ever again. As Damon and his friends walked away from Buckingham Palace, the energy among them had completely changed. What had started as an exciting challenge had turned into an unexpected lesson. Damon had wanted to prove that the royal guards were just for show, that they weren't as strong or disciplined as people believed. But instead, he had been the one put in his place. His friends, who had been laughing and encouraging him earlier, were now quiet. No one spoke for a while as they moved through the busy London streets. The sound of traffic and people filled the air, but inside their small group, there was an uncomfortable silence. Finally, one of Damon's friends, Mark, cleared his throat. "Man, that was different," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I thought he was just gonna stand there like they always do." "Yeah," another friend, Jason, added. "I mean, I've seen videos of people messing with those guards before, but I've never seen one move like that. That was intense." Damon clenched his jaw, but forced a laugh. "Come on, guys," he said, shrugging. It wasn't a big deal. He just took a step forward and shouted, "That's it." But even as he said the words, he knew that wasn't true. It was a big deal. He had faced many tough people in his life, but there had been something different about that guard, something unshakable. His presence, his control, his discipline. It was unlike anything Damon had ever seen before. Jason smirked. "Yeah? Then why did you back up so fast?" The rest of the group chuckled, but Damon didn't find it funny. He had built his entire reputation on being fearless, on never backing down. And yet, for the first time, he had felt something close to fear. Not because the guard had threatened him, but because he had commanded respect in a way Damon had never experienced. "I wasn't scared," Damon muttered. "I just didn't want any trouble." His friends exchanged glances, but didn't say anything. They knew Damon would never admit that the royal guard had shaken him. As they kept walking, Damon's thoughts wandered back to the moment when the guard had moved. The way he had stepped forward so swiftly, his grip tight on his rifle, his voice firm and powerful. It had been a reminder that these men were not just for decoration. They were highly trained soldiers, ready to act at any moment. Damon had always thought of strength as something loud, something that had to be proved through fights and challenges. But this guard had shown him a different kind of strength, one that didn't need words, one that didn't need to prove anything. For the rest of the evening, Damon tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back. That single step forward had changed everything. And no matter how much he told himself it wasn't a big deal, deep down, he knew the truth. He had just learned the hardest lesson of his life. The night had fallen over London, and Damon Cross sat alone in his small apartment, lost in thought. The sounds of the city buzzed outside, cars honking, people talking, life moving on as usual. But inside his mind, things weren't so normal. He kept replaying the moment at Buckingham Palace over and over again. He had never felt like this before. Damon had always been the kind of person who walked into a situation with confidence, knowing he could talk or fight his way out of anything. But the royal guard had been different. He hadn't needed to argue, fight, or even show aggression. He had simply stood his ground, and that alone had been enough to make Damon back away. Damon let out a frustrated sigh and leaned back in his chair. "Why is this bothering me so much?" he muttered to himself. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Jason. "Man, today was crazy. Can't believe that guard moved like that. Thought you were gonna challenge him harder, though." Damon frowned. He picked up the phone but didn't reply. What was he supposed to say? That he had felt something close to fear. That for the first time, he had realized there were people out there with a level of discipline and strength that he could never match. He tossed the phone aside and stood up. He needed to clear his head. Grabbing his jacket, he stepped outside and began walking through the dimly lit streets. The cold night air helped a little, but his thoughts kept racing. He had spent years building a name for himself, proving that he was tough. He had never backed down from anyone. But today, a single step from a royal guard had stopped him in his tracks. As he walked, he passed a group of young men on a street corner, laughing and joking loudly. He recognized the attitude right away. It was the same confidence he used to carry, the same energy of someone who thought they ruled the streets. For a brief moment, he considered walking up to them, maybe starting a conversation, maybe proving to himself that he still had his edge. But then, something inside him stopped him. Would that really change anything? Would challenging someone make him feel any better about what had happened? Damon shook his head and kept walking. He had spent years thinking that strength came from showing off, from proving himself to others. But the royal guard had shown him a different kind of power, one that didn't need to be loud or aggressive. It was a quiet, unshakable confidence. And the more Damon thought about it, the more he realized something. Maybe real strength wasn't about forcing others to see it. Maybe real strength came from within, from discipline, from self-control, from knowing who you were without needing to prove it to the world. For the first time in his life, Damon felt like he had something to learn. And for the first time, he actually wanted to change. The days passed, but Damon Cross couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had changed. He went through his usual routine, meeting his friends, walking through the streets, acting like nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew that the encounter with the royal guard had left a mark on him. He had always thought of himself as strong, fearless, and untouchable. But for the first time, he had seen a different kind of strength, one that didn't need to be loud or aggressive. It was quiet, controlled, and unshakable. One evening, as Damon scrolled through his phone, he came across a video. Someone in the crowd at Buckingham Palace had recorded the moment he had taunted the guard, and now it was all over social media. The comments were mixed. This guy really thought he could break a royal guard. Hilarious. Respect to the soldier. That discipline is next level. The way Damon stepped back so fast, though. Damon felt a mix of emotions as he read through them. A few weeks ago, he would have been angry, maybe even embarrassed. But now he felt something different. He wasn't proud of what he had done. He sighed and locked his phone, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years trying to prove himself, trying to show the world he was tough. But what had that really gotten him? A few laughs. A reputation among his friends. None of it felt important anymore. For the first time, Damon felt like he wanted something more. The next morning, he made a decision. He needed to change. He didn't want to be the guy who picked fights or played childish games to impress others. He wanted to be someone who had real discipline, real confidence, the kind of strength that the royal guard had shown him that day. Damon didn't know exactly where to start, but he knew he had to do something different. Instead of spending his day hanging around aimlessly, He searched for something productive. After some thought, he decided to join a local boxing gym. Not to fight, but to learn, to test his discipline, to push himself in a way he had never done before. At first, the training was tough. The drills, the conditioning, the strict routines, it was nothing like what he was used to. There were no shortcuts, no easy ways out, but something about it felt right. For the first time, Damon wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. He was doing it for himself. Weeks passed, then months. Slowly, he began to change, not just physically, but mentally. He became more focused, more patient. He didn't feel the need to challenge random people on the street or seek attention. One day, as he walked past Buckingham Palace again, he saw another group of tourists laughing and taking pictures. A young man stepped forward, trying to taunt a royal guard, just like Damon had done months ago. Damon stopped and watched for a moment, shaking his head. He knew exactly what was going to happen next. With a small smirk, he turned and walked away.